Welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast for SQL Server developers and database administrators. I'm Kendra Little from SQLWorkbooks.com. This week, my topic is talking about why I don't teach courses about Service Broker. And I didn't come up with this topic just to pick on Service Broker. I got a question recently from a reader who was asking, hey, do you have courses on Service Broker already? Do you plan to make any in the future? And in the past, I've often had conversations with people where they've said, hey, I know Service Broker is a part of SQL Server, but this is something I haven't learned. What's up with that? Have there been any new features with it recently? I don't hear about it a lot anymore. Is that something I should learn? Is that something that you use, Kendra? So I wanted to make this episode to put the Service Broker feature into context, both explaining why I'm not a Service Broker expert, why that just never happened over my career, and what I've observed about Service Broker, the different factors that I believe have influenced the adoption or lack thereof of Service Broker throughout the industry. And I think these are interesting to know in terms of if you're thinking about application architecture and you're thinking about implementing queues, knowing what are the options that a lot of people go for, what are the differences in pricing, what are the newer options that we have these days that we didn't used to have 5 years ago or 10 years ago that also should play into your evaluation. And then finally, I want to talk through options for learning Service Broker. If you need to support a Service Broker application or you're really interested in this and you do want to learn it, there are some great resources out there, and I want to help point you to the people who are experts on Service Broker. So first up, I'm talking about my personal path in tuning SQL Server, in creating applications for SQL Server, in troubleshooting for SQL Server. As a consultant, when I ran into queues in applications that use SQL Server, I tended to run into two types of implementations of queues. And these two types of implementations of queues didn't include SQL Server Service Broker. Now, this is just a personal sampling, right, of my experience as a consultant. It's not like I've worked with every customer on the planet. But in terms of what I found is I did find that some folks have written their own homegrown queues using database tables in SQL Server. So just in user databases, they've created tables and they've designed a simple queue. And at small amounts of scale, this can work just fine. When getting to know clients, I would talk about their application and look at different patterns in their database. And many of these queues, people were not asking for help with them. They were not slow. They were just fine. Oftentimes, the patterns for working with these queues use some processes that insert data into the tables and then little other processes read and handle items in the queue. And one of the patterns that you'll often find with these is that the processes who are handling items in the queue, they will lock that row in the queue and hold on to that lock. And then other processes are like, I'm looking for a new row to process. They'll use a read past tent and go past all the rows that are locked and then find a new row to process. And these patterns have been out on the internet for a long time, and at small amount of scale, they can function well. So I've run into those before. Sometimes they're full of blocking and folks need help on them and want to say, hey, how can we scale this more? And in some of those cases, it was simply a matter of adding some indexes and helping their existing pattern work a little better. In other cases, when folks wanted to know about, hey, how do people really do queues at scale? What would often come to mind is the other customers who I'd run into using the other pattern of doing queues. I ran into multiple consulting customers who were coming to me about a question about their SQL Server. But when I talked to them about their environment, it turns out they had implemented queuing at scale using something other than SQL Server. Lots of them, and again, this is a small sample size, but multiple people said, oh yeah, we use RabbitMQ, and we do all of our queuing in that. Now, RabbitMQ has been around for a while. It's an application that handles queuing, and it is, or at least historically, it has been an open source project. It's been a lot cheaper to license and support. There are lots of folks who use it. And so there's documentation around it, lots of published patterns and practices. And this was very popular with folks that I happened to run into who were using it. The folks that I met who were using it had lots of good things to say about it. They also had good things to say about their SQL Server. They were just reaching out to me for a little bit of help with it. They would reach out to someone else for a little bit of help with RabbitMQ. So I never ended up learning Service Broker because in terms of what influences Service Broker adoption, there was never a big enough reason for me to recommend this to my customers. Because if I think about, okay, if you need to do queuing at scale, in terms of the developers who I meet and I talk with, they are not people who've implemented successful Service Broker implementations at scale, and there's not a lot of Service Broker training and documentation out there. There is some, and I'll point you to it, but over the years, in terms of looking architecturally at what is going to be the cheapest thing for you to implement, SQL Server licenses are not cheap. Now, again, I am not an expert on Service Broker, but I can read the pages in books online about features and additions. And when you look at Service Broker on the features and additions pages, well, Standard Edition is the cheapest edition that has all the features of Service Broker. Even Web Edition, when you look at Web Edition, it says, oh, well, it can only be a client. SQL Server licenses can be some of the most expensive licenses in your environment, and they're usually a much bigger factor than hardware. So if it is possible to implement your messaging outside of the SQL Server, that can reduce a lot of your cost over time. And these applications that specialize in queuing, like RabbitMQ, well, they can be cheaper to license. They can provide durability if you want that. And they may be a better architectural choice for managing these queues. And I do think that historically, this has been one of the big factors as to why Service Broker hasn't taken off as something to do inside of your SQL Server, is simply the cost of licensing. Another factor to take into account is simply that implementing an application in Service Broker is not easy. And the quality you're going to get by the application you design with Service Broker is going to vary depending on how you implement it. Now, this isn't something bad about Service Broker. This is true about a lot of tools out there, right? What we're going to get out of it often has to do with the quality of how we build it. But here's my own personal first experience with Service Broker. Way back in the early days of soon after Service Broker was released, I was a DBA on a fairly large DBA team. And one of our application teams said, hey, this new Service Broker thing sounds great. We're going to implement a new application in it. Well, hey, that sounds great, right? I'm into that. But the implementation didn't go that great. What we ended up with was an application that we would get tickets coming through from the help desk because users would be having a problem. They would be saying, my data isn't showing up, or the screen is just hanging, or X and Y is broken. And we would trace it back to, okay, they're talking about this application that's using Service Broker, but we didn't have any ways to troubleshoot it. We would just be able to look at it and be like, well, there are jobs and they're running. Nothing has failed. There are no messages in any log, and we're going to have to escalate this back to the developer team, who at that time, by the way, was not on call. So it would not be a quick resolution of that problem. Now, is this Service Broker's fault? Well, no, not directly. I don't think it's that our developers were bad developers either, though. I think that we didn't have good patterns, good best practices, or great references to know how do we implement this in a way, and how do we document troubleshooting steps for this in a way that's going to work. And unfortunately, we never actually got there. This ended up being one of those applications where after a while, everyone got so frustrated with it that it was just pulled out. It was completely rewritten without Service Broker. And possibly this is an application that never should have been implemented with queuing in the first place. It was probably one of those cases where, hey, there's a new shiny thing, so let's use it for something. Maybe not the best example, right? This story isn't necessarily about Service Broker. This story is about, I think, how when this feature first came out, it got played around with a lot, but not always in the right ways. And we never got to a place where there were great patterns and practices for it that were just really easily accessible and that led themselves to good use cases. Another story about this, and this one is all secondhand. I mean, this is a story about a service broker implementation that I mainly heard about when playing a first-person shooter game on, one of those game networks where you can chat with other people on your team while you're trying to defeat the monsters. So a person who I met over this game worked at a place where they had a big service broker implementation. And it was really frustrating. And this was multiple SQL servers communicating with one another. And they had hired some consultants, not me, but they'd hired other consultants. And the consultants had come in, and there was just a frustrating relationship going on. And the people the team who worked at the company were frustrated because the consultants couldn't solve their problems. And they were kind of like, they were losing faith in the ability of these consultants and sort of like, oh, they said they could help us, but they just can't help us. Now, I totally get their frustration. But on the other hand, I also independently know the consultants who they were working with. I'm not going to name names. It's not that kind of thing. But the thing is, these are very smart people. These are great people. But this was one of those mismatches where sometimes it's like you're trying to put a Band-Aid on a broken arm. You don't, if you're bringing someone in to try to do a short amount of time to fix something up, and really you need structural changes, like there is a bigger problem. They didn't need short-term consultants to come in and fix this. They needed either longer-term consultants or some sort of development team to look at this thing from the ground up and say, what are the things that this should do that it isn't doing, and what is the best way to fix this? What is the best way to rewrite this application? Because the problems they had in it were just so inherent. And again, there can be terrible implementations of great tools. This isn't necessarily a sign of this, but a lot of people have gotten in over their head because you can do really complex things with queuing applications, right? Another example, and this one is a little happier, is I have had a couple of times in my life when using event notifications was just the best solution for something. One example of this is I had a customer who needed to implement when schema was changed. They needed to implement logging for that. And they wanted to use tools inside SQL Server. Event notifications can do that very well, can pick up, hey, here's this change that happened, let's log it to a table, and maybe let's trigger some other activities on from that. Now, behind the scenes, event notification uses service broker, so I have implemented service broker solutions just because I've implemented event notifications. And it's been very successful. I mean, you do have to take time to learn how event notifications work and how it sets things up behind the scenes, but it was very successful because I wasn't actually really having to do much with Service Broker. There's very established patterns for this that work well. I just had to follow those clear patterns and everything worked very smoothly. In other words, this was so simple that I couldn't mess it up. And even if it was more complex, right, I might be able to come up with a good way to get it to work, but it really takes time and becoming invested in this type of feature to do more complex things with it. But the simpler things like event notifications, even I, who am absolutely not a service broker expert, even I have been able to do those successfully and had them run very happily for future times. A little more context around service broker adoption. So I think historically, licensing was a big issue. Some overeager, problematic, overly complex implementations were a problem and have given a lot of people kind of a wariness of it. But these days, we have a lot more options. So looking just at the Azure cloud, for instance, for Azure SQL Database, if you use the hosted database service of Azure SQL Database, you don't have Service Broker. It's not something that Azure SQL Database provides. And I suspect, I don't have any inside information on this, but I suspect it won't be a feature that Azure SQL Database provides because you have a lot of other options in the cloud. If you're using database as a service and you also want to use queues, Azure gives you multiple options. You can use Azure Queue Storage, or you can use service bus queues. Yes, queuing is such a big topic that there are multiple different flavors of it that you can choose from. And there's a nice page that compares and contrasts and help you figure out, do I want to use one or the other? Because if I want to use cloud services, why not have one that's really great at doing queues that has more of those established patterns built into it, rather than trying to rig something up in Azure SQL database? So that's why I think it wouldn't necessarily make sense to support Service Broker in Azure SQL database, although it unfortunately does also mean you can't use event notifications in Azure SQL database, which I think is kind of a bummer, but there's other ways to do things in the cloud as well, right? We don't have to use all our old tools in the new cloud. Also, we now have managed instances. Managed instances are kind of a hybrid between Azure SQL database and the old install SQL Server on a VM technology, right? So you've got some shared management between the Microsoft team and your team of DBAs, developers, or both, or one or the other. So for Azure managed instances, there is some Service Broker. The page for this, I haven't tested this myself, but the documentation on this says that there's no cross-instance capabilities. So you could basically do event notifications locally, but in terms of designing applications that have service brokers on multiple instances talking to one another, that sounds like that is not going to happen. And again, if you're in the cloud and you really want to design an application around queuing, it does seem like, yeah, at that point, you probably want to use a queue service. And in AWS, there are different queue services. This is now a big thing that folks do. And because of this, because of the fact that we have the licensing issue, we haven't developed a ton of best practices and documentation, and the fact that we now have these specialized Azure queue services, I don't think that there's going to be a big rise in uses for Service Broker, which is why I don't think we're going to have a ton more people becoming experts in Service Broker. But we do have some folks who are already experts who you can lean on if you do want to use Service Broker. And so let's talk about your options for learning Service Broker. There is a book that was published on Service Broker in 2008 by Klaus Aschenbrenner. I do think this book is still valuable because Service Broker hasn't changed 100%, but Klaus recently, in 2016, Klaus wrote a blog post. And in it, he was talking about writing the book and just whether or not he had regrets because Service Broker didn't take off and become an exceedingly popular feature in SQL Server. And it takes a lot of time and effort to write a book. As someone who's never written a book, but has thought about it, like I've written an interview chapter. I've been interviewed for a chapter of a book, and even that was a lot of work, right? But so he put this time into writing the book, and he was reflecting on it. And he said, these days, I don't even work with Service Broker. People hire me for completely different things. Performance tuning, that's my main market. I have no idea about Service Broker these days. And he says that, he's clearly not saying that because he didn't love Service Broker. He clearly thought the technology was really cool and had a lot of promise. It's just that he went in a different direction. And another takeaway from this, though, is if you do end up on a path where it just makes sense for you to use Service Broker, maybe you need to support it somewhere and it's already implemented, or maybe you need to learn some things about it in order to compare it with other queuing options. Say, what are the pros and cons of using those cloud services versus Service Broker, for instance? I do think you can get value out of that. Like Klaus did. He says, I didn't end up working on this a ton, but it was a really valuable part of my journey learning about this. I would just say if you do learn Service Broker, definitely put it into context with the other options and have that architectural perspective of what are the strengths of this approach versus a RabbitMQ approach or versus using a cloud-hosted queuing service approach. That will absolutely set you up to when you're building future applications or when you're talking about scaling applications in an interview, having a perspective that isn't only inside this one queuing application, but shows that, hey, I took the time to understand multiple different queuing applications and how they compare. I think that can be a fantastic investment of your time. In terms of Service Broker resources, Jonathan Caius has a Pluralsight course from 2018 on Service Broker, and he is fantastic when it comes to Service Broker knowledge. He has been working on it for years, and he's going to have fantastic material on there. Yes, I run a training site that is not Pluralsight, and I am recommending that you should look at a Pluralsight course if you need to learn Service Broker, because they're just, it's great material. And if I'm not going to teach about it, I'm going to steer you to it. I mean, heck, even if I do teach about it, I'm also going to steer you to it, because I do really believe that having the best resources out there and linking to one another is absolutely the best way forward for all of us. Jonathan also has blog posts and some free sessions out there. There's, I believe, a SQL Bits session. If you search for Jonathan Caius SQL Bits, I think there's a free online session that he did for Service Broker on as well. And you're going to get a lot of value out of that. That book by Klaus Aschenbrenner is from 2008, but as I said, I think a lot of it is still relevant. And then also, on the web, if you find Remus Rusanu's blog, or if you're looking at Service Broker questions on Stack Overflow, any answers by Remus are gold. Remus Rusanu is on the SQL Server team. I think he's on the SQL Server team now. He's historically been on the SQL Server team if he isn't there presently. And he helped write Service Broker and is just really smart and insightful. So it's always helpful when you're looking on these question and answer sites. So, you learn that some people are just so insightful about specific topics. Remus is insightful about every topic he answers about, including Service Broker. So I would really look for those. In terms of me, when I may teach Service Broker, well, when discussing SQL Server functionality that uses it, it's going to come up because, hey, even if you aren't purposefully adopting SQL Server Service Broker for your queues, if you're using SQL Server and you're using something like database mail, guess what? Database mail uses some Service Broker in the back end. I am actually thinking about setting up a SQL Challenge course related to those event notifications for things like logging when users do schema changes. And that is probably going to mean that I start teaching some Service Broker. And I'm really looking forward to setting up that challenge because I think it's a really useful thing to be able to do in SQL Server. And then I'm not sure. I mean, it looks like at this point, I'm not going to be developing a large Service Broker library, but I am certainly open to things in the future because sometimes the market changes in ways that I don't predict. Now, if you are a big fan of Service Broker, or if you think I've been wrong about something, or if you know about a learning resource that I haven't listed in here, I would love to hear from you and love for you to put a comment on your take on this onto the blog post for this episode. Because, hey, if you've had a different experience with this than me, other people should know about it and they should be able to benefit from it too. I'm Kendra Little from SQLWorkbooks.com. Thanks for listening to Dear SQL DBA. I'll be back with you in an episode soon. Bye, folks.